Well, it's good to be here. It was quite a day yesterday traveling. I had to teach in the morning, so I wasn't able to be here. So I got in at 2 a.m. and then was kept up by a wonderful wedding party till 5 a.m. So I know whereof I speak on the patient acceptance of tribulation. Fortunately, I don't think I was all that patient. But I have seen a number of the presentations today, and I was thinking I'd like to preface my own presentation by saying that I've really found the other presentations fascinating in how many of the themes seem to resonate with each other between the presentations, and I think with a lot of what I'm going to say. While I do feel that it is incumbent upon me to mention that I am a philosopher, and therefore my presentation might be somewhat more abstract and technical than some of the others, I do think that the topic that we're dealing with, the patient acceptance of tribulation, has practical importance not only for us as sufferers and co-sufferers, but also for us as spiritual practitioners engaged in the processes of spiritual practice and theosis, and also as caregivers and co-redeemers of others and the world, if I can use that term. I'd like to begin by hearkening back to a scene from a movie from 1981, Louis Malle's movie, My Dinner with Andre. Does anybody remember that movie? There's a scene in that movie that has stuck with me ever since I saw it. The movie, if you're not familiar with it, it consists of a long, rather strange conversation between the director-producer Andre Gregory and his friend Wallace Shawn, the famous character actor. Andre Gregory describes a telling scene regarding his mother's care in the hospital. He says, "You know, it's like what happened just before my mother died. We'd gone to the hospital to see my mother, and I went in to see her, and I saw this woman who looked as bad as any survivor of Auschwitz or Dachau. And I was out in the hall sort of comforting my father when a doctor, who's a specialist in a problem that she had with her arm, went into her room and came out just beaming. He said, 'Boy, don't we have a lot of reason to feel great? Isn't it wonderful how she's coming along?' Now all he saw was the arm. That's all he saw. I think this scene serves as a kind of metaphor for one of the great risks we run, not only in trying to find meaning in our own suffering or helping others to find meaning in theirs, but in spirituality in general. The danger is that, like the arm specialist in the movie, we run the risk of identifying a single method that works in one or some cases and applying it to everyone. Or sometimes we might apply a doctrine, such as suffering is God's will, without regard to the spiritual resources of the sufferer. Another example of this kind of tunnel vision is the plethora of spiritual bon mots, just pithy sayings drawn from Scripture or the Fathers, you can find daily on Orthodox pages on Facebook and elsewhere. Here, a completely uncontextualized quote, such as St. Joseph of Optina's insight that, quote, we ourselves aggravate our sorrows when we begin to complain. I just saw this the other day on Facebook, is presented as a kind of standalone piece of wisdom. While this seems innocent enough and could even be helpful to some, in other cases, it could amount to telling a suffering person that they deserve their suffering, or that God wills it, or that it would be good for them if they would just stop their whining. The failure here is to provide the context for suffering that can make it meaningful for the sufferer. Sometimes we give part of the context, as when a minister at a funeral invokes the totality theodicy with its famous appeal to God's inscrutable wisdom. We don't know why this person had to die, but God knows. But what happens when the bereaved survivors hear that God has his reasons, but if they fail to see their loved one's death sub species aeternitatis, the fault lies with them, not God? Of course, the doctrine might be sound, but the pastoral approach is not. As C.S. Lewis writes in a somewhat different context, quote, "A particular medicine is not to be mistaken for the elixir of life." The father's therapeutic approach was much more adaptive to differences, while operating within a general cosmological or soteriological, anthropological, and ethico-practical context. Cosmology dealing with the grand context, anthropology here meaning the nature of human being, and the ethico-practical context having to do with not just morality, but also the practices of morality. They knew that we cannot tell everyone who is suffering it's good for you, or that their suffering has meaning whether or not they know what it is. The fathers knew that whether suffering is good, that is spiritually beneficial for a person, depends upon their degree of integration into the cosmological, anthropological, and ethico-practical context. That is, it depends upon their level of spiritual progress and insight. The fathers understood the importance of that key virtue of discernment, the insight to utilize spiritual teachings in a way appropriate to the spiritual readiness of the practitioner, whether oneself or another. So in this paper, I want to present a specific spiritual practice, most often called the patient acceptance of tribulation, within such a context. I will describe the dynamics of the practice of patient acceptance of tribulation within the stages of spiritual progress and within the course of spiritual progress as a whole. These dynamics are complex, since suffering takes on multiple meanings throughout the course of spiritual progress. But before beginning to contextualize suffering, I need to address a terminological issue. Since the practice of the patient acceptance of tribulation may be found in patristic and hesychastic literature under a variety of headings. In monastic literature, patience describes a broader practice, of which the patient acceptance of tribulations is a specific, though important, form. Patience describes all those practices that involve forbearance, acceptance, and forgiveness, which are all types or degrees of that key virtue, dispassion, apatheia. As such, all forms of patience require humility and obedience. Patience, then, is at the heart of a nest of spiritual practices and virtues that are key to spiritual progress. I will try to begin to untangle that nest later. Patient acceptance might also be called patient endurance or long suffering. Some other terms used for tribulation are what comes. It's a nice vague term, isn't it? Just what comes, accepting what comes. Tribulation, suffering, cares, evils, and hardships. We have to be a little careful with the term evils, however, since it could mean tribulation or suffering, or it could refer to moral transgressions, which is another kind of suffering. Closely related terms, or terms that connote specific types of suffering, include censure from men, that is, criticism, adversity, misfortune, hostility, insult, malice, demonic attack, physical illness, and disability. Suffering can be willingly undergone or unwillingly undergone in two different senses. First, we can suffer from events that happen to us, events that are caused by other people or circumstances such as illness. Second, we can undertake practices that bring suffering on ourselves, ascetic practices, some forms of healing practices, such as taking bitter medicine, or undergoing the physical pain that leads to healing, such as the setting of a bone. Whether we are the agent of the suffering or not does not determine whether the suffering is intentional in the sense that I'll give this term later. For now, suffice it to say that suffering is intentional, whether or not we are the agent of it, when we accept it patiently for the sake of spiritual progress. The literature on the practice of the patient acceptance of tribulation, whether ancient or modern, is rich but scattered. In patristic and hesychastic literature, we find frequent references to the practice, but in accordance with the common practice of the fathers, these references appear unsystematic. In more recent literature, C.S. Lewis's The Problem of Pain does place suffering in its cosmological and soteriological context, but Lewis does not refer to the patristic, much less hesychastic traditions. The only attempt that I am aware of that presents the endurance of affliction in all its complexity is that of Jean-Claude Larcher. Larcher's work presents all the nuances of the practice, and Larcher demonstrates his awareness of many of the dynamics of spiritual progress. However, while his books are invaluable resources for the patristic teaching on suffering, he does not integrate his analysis of suffering within a theory of the system of practices itself, which is what I hope to do. Therefore, while it would certainly be churlish of me to criticize his brilliant scholarship, I believe there's still some work to be done. After all, unfortunately, Larcher's magnum opus is his dissertation, which is over 900 pages, in French, and only available on microfiche. Good fun. Thus, while the details of the practice are well worked out, there has been little or no attempt to view the practice within the context of the system of spiritual practices itself, that is, within the course of spiritual progress. There are good reasons for this lack, one of which I have to address before attempting such a contextualization myself. While my purpose is to argue for a theory of practice, and this theory presents spiritual practice, and in particular hesychastic practices, as a system, much of the literature on suffering is unsystematically presented precisely because it is found in literature that concerns the pragmatics of spirituality, and therefore does not place a priority on systematization. The purpose of these writings is, by and large, therapeutic and existential, and for this reason they're not systematic in the sense of modern theoretical, logical, or scientific systems of thought. However, there's a need, I think, for a theory of spiritual practice to provide the context for understanding practices like the patient acceptance of tribulation. Today, we lack the hermeneutic context that previously provided coherence and meaning to these practices. A theory of practice, I hope, can provide that context without betraying the spirit of the original texts, by providing a kind of meditation on the system of practices itself. A meditation on the system of practices itself, another practice also recommended by the Fathers. In addition, such a theory will, I hope, help caretakers of all kinds to integrate traditional spiritual practices into their care, and of sufferers to utilize their suffering for their spiritual progress. With these purposes in mind, then, let's look at the context of the patient acceptance of tribulation within the system of spiritual progress. And that system is usually presented in terms of the three stages of spiritual progress: purification, illumination, and perfection or theosis. However, the terminology of stages does not fully describe the dynamic and complex development of and relationships between the practices undertaken. The stages are not necessarily fixed or linear, or even undertaken one at a time. Thus, some of the effects of illumination are available even to those who have never engaged in serious spiritual practice, while on the other hand, an advanced practitioner, someone who's more or less achieved illumination, for example, might have failed to perfect certain virtues of the purification stage, might still be working on them. In addition, these stages and the practices that comprise them take on different meanings in relationship to the development of spiritual knowledge, on the one hand, and righteousness on the other. The Fathers were acutely aware of these dynamics and their complexities, and therefore we have many different interpretations of the stages in the hesychastic writings. These differences of interpretation of the stages of spiritual progress demonstrate the therapeutic intent of the hesychastic Fathers, that they were willing to adapt the simple three-stage schema to the therapeutic needs of different persons, or to emphasize different practices and virtues. For example, St. Maximus employs a wide variety of biblical images as metaphors for the three stages, and each different image provides an importantly different message. This complexity points to the fact that the hesychastic system of spiritual progress is a system for treating hypostases, not only human beings as integrated beings of body, soul, and spirit, which we all share, but also as unique expressions of the image of God. We see this adaptability to personal spiritual differences in the many chains of virtues found in the hesychastic writings. These writings often emphasize the point that the building of virtues is systematic. There is an order and a method to building the virtues. Despite this, if we compare the many chains of virtues, we find that they are frequently very different. The virtues presented may vary, and their order may vary. This is explained not only by the different persons for whom the text is intended. The intended audience for a specific text is often indicated at the beginning of the text, by the way. We sometimes gloss over those prefaces. We shouldn't do that. But also by the telos, or the final goal of the chain of virtues. In regard to the patient acceptance of tribulation, for example, Evagrius gives us a chain that links patient acceptance to the taming of the insensitive faculty, and further to praying with joy. Since, for Evagrius, pure prayer is an important goal, he links patient acceptance of tribulation he links patient acceptance of tribulation to the ending of the greatest obstacle to pure prayer, namely attachment to passions. On the other hand, St. Hesychios reverses the order, presenting patient acceptance of tribulation as the fruit of humble and undistracted prayer. St. Maximus the Confessor agrees with Evagrius that patient acceptance of tribulation leads to dispassion, since, conversely, patient attachment to things leads to suffering in the first place. But he links dispassion to hope in God, which in turn, quote, separates the intellect from every worldly attachment, resulting in the telos of this chain, the love for God. The result of this illumination is, he says, insensibility or apatheia, a complete detachment from all created things. While these chains differ significantly, and therefore provide different therapeutic contexts for suffering, they agree in placing the patient acceptance of tribulation within the insensitive or irascible faculty of the soul. As Evagrius says, long-suffering and forbearance are practices proper to the insensitive power of the soul. Nevertheless, patient acceptance of tribulation is also related to our appetitive and intellective faculties in the forms of ascetic practices on the one hand and meditative practices on the other. In order to begin to work out the relationships between these practices and virtues, we need to identify the dynamics of spiritual progress and place the practice within that context. Here I will consider the following characteristics of spiritual progress. The terminology sounds worse than the actual working out, so bear with me. So these are the characteristics of spiritual progress: intentionality and potentiation. Potentiation just meaning that intentionality is a scale. There can be more higher and lower forms of intentionality. The second term is scopos and telos, which I will explain in a minute. Also multivalence, overdetermination, and transformability. The difference between a spiritual practice undergone and a spiritual practice undertaken is intentionality, the conscious engagement of the practice for the sake of the telos of the practice. This requires, moreover, a process of gathering oneself into the world of the practice, that is, its cosmological, anthropological, and ethico-practical context. When we do this, we realize quickly the complex dynamics of each practice, how each practice relates to all the others, how each symbol or metaphor acts as a mirror of all the other symbols and metaphors. We can distinguish three main degrees or types of intentionality. First, there's the pre-intentional or naive undergoing of suffering. Here, the sufferer regards her or his suffering as unjustified, perhaps, or as a punishment. If thought is given to the source of the suffering, it might be viewed as undeserved or a punishment, or, as Americans sometimes say, bad karma. The naive experience of suffering, in effect, adds to the bodily suffering the negativity, pessimism, or even nihilism of the despairing outlook, and in turn finds justification for this outlook in the seeming meaninglessness or undeserved nature of the suffering. A much more enlightened view of suffering is represented by the Stoic approach. Stoics held that suffering is to be avoided at all, if at all possible, but if it became inevitable, then it should be tolerated. For the Stoics, suffering did not have positive or redemptive value, except inasmuch as it contributed to self-control. Aspects of the Stoic attitude inform the Christian approach, though with significant modifications. Thus, St. Maximus points out that, quote, "He who has not severed his attachment to material things will always experience affliction, since his state of mind depends on things that are naturally changeable, and so it alters when they do," end quote. A point that could have been made by Epictetus. Epictetus would agree with St. Maximus that the endurance of such affliction can lead to dispassion. What Epictetus could not have said, however, is that, as St. Maximus does say, is that through trials and temptations, the intellect will rejoice and delight in weakness, affliction, and calamity, or that suffering and opportunities for humiliation should be sought. The third level of suffering, of the patient acceptance of suffering, is sort of the lowest level of the Christian attitude towards suffering, which I would call the moral level, which sees suffering as the result of perhaps of original sin or a providential punishment of human sin or individual sin, not willed by God, but perhaps allowed by God. The theodicies are generally understood at this moral level, but I think they actually become more meaningful at the next level. The next level then would, at the moral level still, imitation of Christ is a moral, physical, or socio-ethical imitation. The next level then of the Christian understanding of suffering sees it in the context of spiritual progress, related to the formation of other virtues and giving rise to other virtues, and as the imitation of Christ in the soteriological meaning of Christ's suffering. The highest level of the Christian understanding of suffering, intentionally undergone, is the acceptance of suffering not as deserved, but as an aspect of divine providence, and therefore the suffering is received with humility, patience, and even gladness. Here, models include the sufferings of the martyrs and the saints, and of course the ultimate model, Christ himself. The degree of potentiation of intentionality, that is, the degree to which we, as sufferers, can utilize our suffering for the sake of spiritual transformation, is determined by the degree of our awareness of our own spiritual status. And this is not always, or perhaps ever, clear to us. For example, I know someone who, when she gets sick, suffers it with martyr-like meekness. Not, mind you, because she is meek, but because she is passive-aggressive and enjoys the attention from others that her sickness brings her. She, I am certain, regards herself as patiently undergoing suffering, and probably sees it as God's will because it satisfies her ego. The intentionality with which we undertake a practice does not mean that we are free of such delusions. What is needed in addition is discernment, but this is a very difficult and paradoxical virtue, since ultimately there are never sufficient conditions for perceiving our own spiritual state for ourselves. Because of the indeterminacy of intentionality, the fact that discerning our own true spiritual status is extremely difficult, we need to continue to look further at the dynamics of spiritual progress, as this gives a context within which to discern our motivations. A key to this discernment in regard to reading the texts wisely and utilizing the teachings with discernment is teleology. That is, that practices consist of a skopos, a range or series of different levels of a practice or virtue, and a telos, a perfect state toward which the skopos leads. The degree of intentionality of a practice determines its skopos relative to the telos. This range may include non-religious, secular modes, as well as spiritual modes of suffering. In addition, the different modes of a practice are not discrete, but form a continuum. In the case of the patient acceptance of suffering, suffering may be undergone in ways that result in bitterness, anguish, and despair, or it may be consciously undergone for the sake of building virtue, selflessness, or in imitation of Christ's sufferings. Patience, too, is a virtue with value in the life of the individual and society. It is at once a personal and a civic virtue, each having their own modes. We are all trained from an early age to be patient, to put up with or ignore our annoying siblings and others. We certainly would not be considered as successful as adults if we were not able to exercise patience in regard to the many challenges of social life. Patience as a spiritual practice, however, includes all of those practices and virtues that contribute to selflessness, such as forgiveness, humility, discretion, and ultimately attentiveness and ezekia. The telos of the patient acceptance of tribulation is perfect patience and endurance of suffering. Examples of perfect patience and endurance might include St. Silouan's "Keep your mind in hell and despair not," or the Desert Father, who not only allowed thieves to rob him, but then ran after them with something they missed. And of course, Christ's silence during his passion. The skopos telos structure of a spiritual practice means that each practice is multivalent. At the first level, multivalence is a hermeneutic or interpretive tool. It points to the fact that the same term for a practice or virtue may connote many different forms of the practice or virtue. Thus, perfect prayer might just be called prayer, or the term prayer might connote a specific kind of prayer. This is a critical tool for interpreting hesychastic and other spiritual texts. At a deeper level, multivalence points to the dynamic nature of a skopos of practice. That is, that a practice occurs at many different levels of intentionality. Prayer for the beginner is not the same as prayer for the advanced practitioner. By the same token, as I've already indicated, we cannot just apply a moral rule or spiritual therapy without being cognizant of the level at which it is to be applied. Therefore, in hesychasm, as in other systems of practices, each practice, symbol, or virtue carries multiple meanings and can even carry meanings in conflict with one another. This is the characteristic of overdetermination. Sometimes this overdetermination is mistaken for paradox, but usually paradoxes between different meanings of the same practice are the result of ignoring the transformative nature of spiritual practice. As transformation proceeds, each practice takes on different meanings. As we engage a practice over a period of time, we encounter a deepening, it is to be hoped, of the meaning of the practice, which is reciprocal with our deepening of our intentionality. I call this quality of spiritual practice transformability. Transformability connotes the experience that as intentionality is potentiated, as it gets more and more intense, through undertaking the practices, we transform, becoming more and more conscious and discerning of its true nature. However, this is only half the truth, for as we transform, the practices also transform. That is, there is a reciprocal transformation between practitioner and practice. As spiritual practice progresses, these transformations become more and more perfect until they become, in effect, constant.
We're running out of time.
Yes. At the highest level, this reciprocal transformability of practitioner and practice eventuates in the paradoxical experiences of illumination and theosis, including the transcendence of the subject-object structure of natural experience, the transcendence of space and time, and even, as St. Maximus tells us, the transcendence of mortality. The hesychastic system of spiritual practices provides a comprehensive therapeutic in which practices like the patient acceptance of tribulation can provide powerful means for our spiritual transformation. These practices are, as St. Maximus says of the virtues, modalities of God's presence. As we come to realize them as such, we enter more and more fully into the divine presence and become more and more agents of transformability for ourselves, for others, and for the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your excellent paper.
Thank you.
I especially toward the beginning, when you began with describing that hesychastic practice adapts. That was refreshing. And I in particular want to ask a kind of detailed question and just maybe get your feedback. So Larche, in his regard for mental health practice or mental health care, kind of heavily relies upon traditional texts that include demons and demonic possession and oppression in his discussion of mental health. And I wonder if you could give personal recommendations or thoughts on how, as Orthodox faithful, we should resource these early texts, but then also adapt with discernment, adapt our application of these texts so that we can be mindful of the suffering of those with mental health disorders in a way that doesn't give them the impression that we believe that what they're going through and the type of suffering that they're going through that we're asking them to be patient about is oriented toward the demonic.
Excellent question, and I say excellent, I'm not just blowing smoke, because that's one of the questions I would ask too. I think there are, I might have the beginnings of an answer. I don't think maybe I have a complete answer. One answer that we can find in Archimandrite Sophroni's book on St. Silouan is that the demons are objectifications of vices, or better, passions, I should say. So that's one way of thinking. I'm not sure that the term objectification there is quite right. Personification would be good if we remember the more technical theological understanding, Christian understanding of person. That these are personifications of our passions. In terms of utilizing that insight in order to deal with or to care for people with mental disorders, I might be a little out of my league on that. But I think that would be the direction I would head. I think, yeah, I'd love to be able to say more, but this occurs to me as one of the significant questions that I also would have, that I've not come across any place where it's answered adequately.
Just to expand, I don't know, the interest of mine is to sort of look at how mental illness was seen in the early Christians, and a lot of the first saints that were physicians as well made a distinction between psychiatric illness and spiritual illness.
Well, and on the other hand, in some writings, there's just almost a complete conflation of demons and passions. They basically are two different aspects, perhaps, of the same thing. So, I definitely think, and I think where your question is headed, is that there is therapeutic value in trying to figure that out, but I haven't been able to figure it out yet.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.